Thank you so much, Kit, for the introduction. Again, like they mentioned, my name is Jacob, and I am currently a research assistant with the Kansas Center for Autism Research and Training. But prior to that role, I worked in community-based suicide prevention in Pinellas County, Florida, so that Tampa Bay region. And what we did there was kind of help kind of facilitate suicide prevention programs that were led by the community, by different communities within our overarching Tampa Bay community. So I'm very happy to be here today with you all. And then kind of just before we begin, I just want to recognize the fact that we are talking about suicide and suicide prevention. That can definitely be a challenging or potentially triggering topic for some people. So if you ever need to kind of step away from the computer screen or anything, please do so, and feel free to take a minute to take care of yourself. And then also I have embedded some discussion questions into this presentation, so please feel free to unmute yourself when they come up or type in the chat, because I would love to hear your guys' thoughts. So here are some of my objectives for today's presentation. We're going to understand the warning signs, the risk factors, and protective factors for suicide. We're also going to understand some of the research gaps for suicide prevention and some of the disparities that autistic individuals experience. And then we're also going to learn the importance of screening for suicide and some strategies to prevent suicide in the autistic community. And I really kind of want to highlight the second objective about understanding the research gaps for suicide prevention, especially within the autistic community. The research is very constantly evolving. So like it was kind of mentioned earlier, the information that is in this presentation is backed by evidence, but there are also a lot of limitations to some of this, as it is constantly changing as we kind of get to, as we kind of find out more information about the why and the how behind suicide within the autistic community. And then some language when talking about suicide. You might hear me kind of say some of these terms. So we want to avoid saying failed, unsuccessful, or successful suicide. We do that because using those terms can kind of sensationalize suicide and imply that suicide is something that should be achieved. So instead, we can say suicide attempt, attempted suicide, suicide death. Those would all be kind of more appropriate. And then we also want to avoid saying committed suicide. That's because the term committed can be kind of associated with a crime or a sin, and that can potentially be stigmatizing to survivors of suicide loss, those being friends and family of someone that has died by suicide, or someone that has attempted suicide themselves. So instead, we would like to say died by suicide or took their own life. So here's a discussion question for you. When you hear mental health, what comes to mind? And there are no right or wrong answers. I just kind of wanted to see everyone's thoughts there. But yeah, feel free to unmute if you'd like to share or type something in the chat. Again, no wrong or right answers. Okay, so Kit thinks of mental well-being. Christy said psychological well-being. Yeah, I think those are kind of right on the money there. So I will kind of reiterate those responses. So mental health is a state of well-being. So we all kind of have mental health. Our mental health, it enables us to cope with the stresses of everyday life. It enables us to kind of realize our abilities and contribute to not only ourselves, but also to the community. And so mental health is not just kind of the presence or absence of a mental health condition. Everyone has it, and it's experienced differently from one person to the next, and as well as from time to time as well. So it is that state that is potentially always changing. And then another discussion question for you. Do you think that mental health conditions and suicidal ideation are related? And again, feel free, type in the chat or unmute. And I'll especially emphasize that there are no right or wrong answers for this one as well. All right, so looking at the chat, we have a couple responses. How an individual is able to navigate their environment, combining the physical with mental processes. Yeah, so that definitely relates to mental health and that being a state of well-being for sure. So we think yes, for mental health conditions and suicidal ideation being related. Yes, they can be, but not always. They're related, but you can have one or the other or both. Then not necessarily, not every mental health condition leads to suicidal ideation, and not every suicidal ideation is caused by mental health systems. Yes, so those were great responses. You guys all kind of hit that on the money as well. So one statistic is that kind of 54% of people who die by suicide do not have a diagnosed mental health condition. And, you know, some truth to that could be the fact that these individuals just haven't been diagnosed yet or received mental health treatment. But it's kind of important to realize that one doesn't have to necessarily have the presence of a mental health condition to die by suicide. And just kind of consider that suicidal crises can also come from just challenging life events. And those can be, you know, grief, social isolation, financial hardship, job loss, bullying and discrimination are some other ones. So yeah, it is just kind of important to acknowledge both points, to not assume that everyone who dies by suicide has a mental health condition, but not assume that everyone who has a mental health condition will consider suicide at the same time. And then so I kind of want to talk about the interpersonal theory of suicide. So the IPTS is a theory of what is kind of necessary for a suicide attempt to occur. And this applies to the non-autistic community, but it has also been backed that it is applicable to the autistic community as well. So I kind of want to highlight these two concepts within this framework. Thwarted belongingness is an individual's need to belong is unmet. And then perceived burdensomeness is an individual's perception that others are burdened and would be better off without them. So I just kind of want to highlight those two constructs before we get into some of the risk factors, and just kind of keep that in mind and think about how these concepts might interact with some of the risk factors that autistic individuals might experience. So here is kind of a diagram of how all the concepts or the constructs kind of like flow together. So really it's the fact that the capability for suicide and the thoughts of suicide are necessary for a suicide attempt to occur. And those thoughts of suicide are fueled by that combination of thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness. So that feeling of I'm alone and that feeling of I'm a burden. So when those two kind of interact, they do have the potential to result in hopelessness that can eventually turn into thoughts of suicide. And I just kind of want to bring this framework up to kind of denounce any like notions that having autism spectrum disorder might make someone suicidal. Because just like everyone else, those concepts, thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness, is what leads to those feelings of hopelessness that could eventually turn into thoughts of suicide. And tragically, our autism community might have many more experiences with feeling some of those things. And then here are some risk factors for suicide. A lot of these can definitely be applicable to the autistic community, but there needs to be more research into understanding the weight and how they might put autistic individuals at risk. And also kind of understanding how these risk factors can be interrelated. So on the next slide, I do have some risk factors that are evident within the autistic community, but a good example of kind of the interrelationship of these risk factors is kind of looking at reduced access to healthcare. So reduced access to healthcare could also mean reduced access to mental and behavioral health care. And then for an individual that could be experiencing a mental health condition, such as like depression, this might also mean that there are barriers to their treatment services. And then for an autistic individual, this could also mean a late diagnosis as well. It could mean receiving a late diagnosis, receiving a diagnosis in adulthood, or not receiving any diagnosis at all. And on the next slide, we will kind of talk about how a late diagnosis is considered a risk factor for suicide, because then does that late diagnosis imply that there could be a lack of support when it's needed? Does it make it harder to regulate emotions, or does that affect someone's self-esteem, etc., as some of the other risk factors that are listed on this slide? So I just wanted to share that interrelationship to kind of frame how these risk factors impact different communities within the autistic community as well. So here are some risk factors that apply to the autistic community. Some of them as well also apply to the non-autistic community, but a late diagnosis is what we just kind of talked about. That is considered a risk factor for suicide. And women, autistic women, are often more likely to receive that late diagnosis. And then adverse life events, autistic people can be at greater risk for being bullied, experiencing financial problems, being socially excluded, or facing workplace or relationship problems. And then camouflaging. Camouflaging could also be referred to as masking. And what masking and camouflaging is it kind of is when an individual is kind of masking their autistic traits to fit in with other people. And what that can do over a prolonged period of time is potentially lead to autistic burnout. And autistic burnout is kind of characterized by the exhaustion, withdrawal, diminished executive functioning, and loss of skills due to the stress of living in a neurotypical world. So it's kind of the cycle of masking and still feeling that thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness, despite efforts to kind of mask autistic traits in unaccommodating environments that can kind of leave individuals feeling that burnt out and exhausted and potentially hopeless over time. And then here are some other risk factors as well. So cognitive inflexibility is kind of referring to the difficulty in adapting one's thinking and behaviors in response to kind of like new information or changing situations. Social isolation. So autistic people may face social and communicational problems, and they might also experience social exclusion, which can lead to isolation and a lack of support. And I'm not sure if it is still the current U.S. Surgeon General, but if not the current, but the most recent has stated that social isolation and the feeling of social connection is one of his top priorities, as it has a lot of effects on physical health as well, which is a really interesting concept. And then, of course, mental health challenges. That's a risk factor for everyone. And unfortunately, autistic people might be more likely to experience concurrent mental health problems, such as anxiety and depression. And those mental health challenges are likely going to exacerbate a lot of other risk factors for suicide as well. So because of these risk factors, unfortunately, autistic individuals are at 2 to 7 times greater risk for suicide. And I'll say this is a very wide range. Part of it is because this range includes youth and adults. And there's a lot of variability across studies. But consistently, autistic individuals do unfortunately report higher rates than non-autistic individuals across the majority of all studies. And then so this is kind of based on rates of a recent like meta-analysis. So what that is kind of combining and synthesizing findings from like multiple independent studies. So again, like I mentioned with some of the research gaps and limitations, there is a lot of variability to kind of pinpoint the exact rates of suicide, but this is kind of combining multiple studies. And these percentages are based on within a past year. So among autistic children and teens, 20% reported suicidal ideation versus 14.2% reported suicidal ideation among non-autistic children and teens, as well as 10% reported attempts for autistic children and teens versus 4.5% reported suicidal attempts in the non-autistic population. And then unfortunately, we do see these percentages and rates rise among adults. So among autistic adults, 42% reported suicidal ideation and 18% reported an attempt. And that number increases substantially among autistic adults that have been diagnosed in adulthood. So we kind of see how that late diagnosis could be a risk factor for suicide as well. And then so suicide in autistic females. So there is a lot of mixed findings regarding the risk of suicide in autistic females. And I will say this slide is kind of based on globally. So not necessarily within the United States, because I have always heard that autistic females may be at higher risk compared to autistic males. But some recent kind of global findings have suggested that autistic females and autistic males may share the similar risk of suicide, and that actually some of these studies may have implied that the risk of death by suicide for autistic females relative to non-autistic females was significantly larger than the risk for autistic males relative to non-autistic males. So that is still very notable, as this does differ within the neurotypical population, males are considered at a much higher risk relative to non-autistic females. So that is definitely notable that both autistic females and males might share the similar risk. And I will just again add that the data is very limited on estimating the risk for suicide. It's very limited in understanding how different like intersectionalities will play a role into suicide risk. So that being understanding how race and ethnicity plays a role, understanding how like gender and sexual minorities play a role, then as well as consideration for the social determinants of health, like socioeconomic status and geographic regions and stuff. Because we can't necessarily assume that the autistic community exhibits the same rates in the non-autistic community. So just something to consider as well when we think about what is needed to better understand within further research. And then so now we kind of have protective factors for suicide, and protective factors for suicide are the opposite of risk factors. They are factors that protect someone from suicide. So generally speaking, these are some protective factors. There is very limited data on protective factors within the autistic community. It's very likely that these can also apply to autistic individuals. But again, we don't understand the weight at which some of these might protect an autistic individual from suicide. Just like in the neurotypical community, we need to better understand how these factors might carry more or less weight in terms of protection from suicide. So if we, I guess, do not have much data on some of these protective factors within the autistic community, so what are some things that we can do? So we can reduce risk factors, and there's several different ways that I guess we could do that. One of them is modeling coping skills and expressing emotions. And some of these might apply across all ages. Some of them might apply just among kind of autistic children as well. So how to model like coping and expressing emotions. Having a conversation with your child about what coping skills are and kind of how they can use them to feel calm and in charge of their emotions. And just recognizing that as a caregiver, it is important to express your emotions in a healthy manner in front of your child, to kind of model that so they can feel kind of the same, and knowing that it is a safe space to kind of share when they're experiencing negative emotions, but as well as share when they're feeling some of those positive emotions as well. And then building supports and connectedness. This is likely to be a very strong protective factor within the autistic community. And I want to emphasize that quality connectedness as well. So connecting autistic individuals with other autistic individuals and the community as a whole is incredibly beneficial to one's mental well-being. And then as well as strengthening their sense of purpose. This could be through different outlets, different special interest, creative expression, etc. And then taking care of your physical health needs. So that is just, that's kind of basic: eating right, sleeping, physical exercise, as well as, maintaining routines, all provide physical health benefits that are likely to improve someone's mental well-being as well. And then kind of empowering self-autonomy. So this is also kind of dependent on some age factors as well, but allowing children to make independent choices, allowing, or not allowing, but brainstorming solutions together, kind of offering guidance when it's needed, and providing explanations for rules or expectations, and just kind of overall minimizing judgment or control as well. And then quality mental health support. This can also be a big one, especially from licensed professionals that have an expertise in autism or maybe autistic themselves. That can make a big difference in outcomes for an individual. And you know, each person might have different needs, you know, based on if they have a mental health condition, if they don't. So just kind of allowing that space for them to either, whether that's like receiving therapy, medication, a combination of approaches, or just someone to provide some effective strategies for coping as well. And then we also want to limit access to lethal means. So lethal means is kind of what it implies. It's a means for taking one's own life. So that could be a firearm or unused medications. We want to limit access to that for general safety reasons, but as well as preventing suicide as well. Do you guys see a black screen?
Yes.
Don't know why it is going dark. Let's try this again.
Still a black screen.
Let's try. Let me try refreshing real quick. Sorry. Okay. Let's hope this works. We love technology issues. Okay, how about now? Okay. All right, so sorry about that. But yeah, so those are some ways to reduce risk factors. And obviously we know that reducing autistic burnout is also necessary, as that can create a lot of strain on an autistic individual's overall well-being. So there's some things that autistic individuals can do themselves, but obviously a lot of this is contingent on some age factors as well as what environment an individual is in, which is why I've also included some things that those that support them can do, because reducing autistic burnout really, it boils down to like truly just creating environments that support neurodiversity. It's really just kind of adjusting that environment to be more accommodating for everyone's needs. So there are some strategies that autistic individuals can do, such as reducing masking when possible. So kind of identifying when you might be masking more or the most, and then kind of creating safe spaces or environments where you can be your authentic self without judgment, and kind of practicing that unmasking when possible, and kind of dropping some of those performative behaviors. Prioritizing sensory regulation, as well as managing energy and downtime. So schedule that recovery time. Plan regular non-negotiable breaks between activities or social events, or work or school or something like that. And then rest without guilt. That can also be a challenging thing to kind of learn. Just recognizing that resting is not laziness. And burnout recovery often requires a lot of time than what some people might expect. And then some things that those that support them can do is taking time to truly understand what autistic burnout is, how it affects each individual differently, and how each individual might experience burnout. As well as, respecting boundaries and improving communication, providing and if you can't provide, advocating for accommodations. And just overall being a safe and non-judgmental person truly goes a long way. And then asking what helps, believing them, and then offering ongoing support as well. And we always want to involve autistic individuals in decision-making processes, whether that be, at work or school or within their own kind of medical decisions, etc. We always want to include and empower autistic voices, and recognizing that their insights are invaluable in creating effective spaces, and just also recognizing that each person's needs and experiences are unique, and that personalized strategies are kind of going to be the most effective in preventing suicide. So I have one other discussion question for you guys. So when you hear warning signs, what comes to mind? And again, feel free to put it in the chat or go ahead and unmute yourself as well. And I'm just seeing the comment about Topeka High School having students create a neurodivergent club, and they're advancing the narrative extremely well. That is awesome. Yeah, that's incredibly important in making our environments more neurodiverse. All right, so we have a couple things. So warning signs, conditions that are present which would make it more likely a person would attempt or harm themselves. I think of statements like, I don't want to wake up, things that increase the likelihood someone attempts suicide, or giving away possessions. So those are all good. I will say some things, yeah, actually no, those are all right on the money. Those would all be considered warning signs. One thing that I would like to kind of reframe is when you hear that term warning signs, I also want you to think of the term invitations, and that being invitations to ask about suicide. That was something that I heard during a suicide prevention training, and that really kind of made a lot of difference for me in my framework of kind of thinking. So if you ever kind of see someone or hear about someone, exhibiting a potential warning sign, view that as an invitation for you to ask or encourage someone else to ask. So here are some invitations to ask about suicide. Sorry, I'm losing my mouse. But yeah, so they can kind of be physical actions or they can be words. The main thing that I really want to emphasize is that really any extreme behavior change could be considered a warning sign. And a common misconception of that is the fact that warning signs or invitations to ask about suicide have to have kind of like a negative connotation, but really it's just any extreme behavior change. So an example of, I guess, what would stereotypically be considered like a positive trait would be like if someone is usually very shy or quiet and is all of a sudden chatting with everyone in the room and being very social. If that is out of the norm for them, that could kind of imply that maybe they are kind of at peace with their decision. and they don't really feel anything holding them back from kind of being social, especially if this is a very abrupt change. And then some others, are kind of what we might expect. Some of the things that you mentioned, withdrawal, loss of interest, those physical health changes such as disturbed sleep, changing or a loss of appetite or weight. And I think we also heard giving away possessions in the chat as well. So here are some invitations to ask about suicide among autistic people, and this was found from the 988 website, and we will kind of talk a little about 988 as well. But yeah, so these were created by autistic people, clinicians, and researchers for the purposes of kind of expanding these resources for autistic individuals. And these are a proposed list. So that's kind of why they just they propose this set of invitations or warning signs, just because there's a real lack of resources out there for autistic individuals among suicide within suicide prevention. So it's often that if an individual is at imminent risk of suicide, they're often going to be experiencing multiple of these warning signs. So a lot of these are applicable to the non-autistic community as well. But some things that maybe stand out are kind of like a new focus on suicidal talk or ideation or death-related topics that are not considered a special interest, and perseverative or suicidal thoughts and ruminations. So kind of just repeatedly thinking about that as well. And then seeking means or kind of making plans for suicide, or kind of almost like rehearsing suicide, are some of the ones that may kind of stand out. And then now we've already heard some research gaps, but why not stop there? So here are some other kind of things to consider when we think about suicide prevention within the autistic community. So yeah, in 2025, there is unfortunately an extremely limited amount of data on validated screening tools that are designed to assess suicide risk among autistic individuals. And I'm just going to be very blunt here that is an unacceptable health inequity. It's very unfortunate that we do not have a validated screening tool within the autistic community in present day. I will say there are strides for improvement on this. So let's get into what does kind of like our current data tell us. So the ASQ is the Ask Suicide Screening Questions. So this has been used to assess suicide risk among some autistic children and adolescents, but there's a lot of preliminary data on this, and it kind of suggests that it may be a strong screening tool, but hasn't really been fully validated. But there is a lot of ongoing research with this right now. And then real quick, the Columbia Protocol is an app that you can kind of use that is for the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. And this app, I definitely recommend it. I think there's currently like one study that's showing that this also may be useful to measure suicide risk among autistic youth without the presence of an intellectual disability. But again, there needs to be a lot more research to fully validate this screening tool. But I will just add, this app is like very user-friendly. You do not need to be a clinician to kind of assess suicide risk using this app. It kind of walks you through every question step by step. And at the end, it'll kind of suggest some further steps to take based on that level of suicide risk. And if you allow it to track your location, it will also kind of suggest a local resource that you can reach out to as well if needed, along with, I believe, 988. All right, so what if I'm worried that my child might be having thoughts of suicide? What if my child tells me that they're having thoughts of suicide? So obviously we want to explore those invitations. We want to explore those warning signs. You can do this by kind of, stating that I've been noticing X, Y, and Z. And that's how you can kind of start that conversation. Um, and then always, when asking anybody about suicide, you want to be direct as possible. You don't want to leave any room for interpretation. You want to ask them, are you having thoughts of suicide? This is also going to be applicable to the autistic community. You can't necessarily say, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Because then that's kind of up for interpretation. Because hurting oneself doesn't necessarily mean thinking about dying by suicide. And then you also have to be specific. An autistic individual may have a different understanding of your question if you were to ask, have you been having recent thoughts of suicide? Because their definition of recent could be different from our definition of recent. So be specific. Have you had thoughts of suicide today? Have you had thoughts of suicide in the last week or the last 2 weeks as well? And then, if needed, definitely use visual supports that are necessary, that might be necessary, like mood charts or emotion cards to kind of assist in expressing feelings. And just kind of be patient. Be patient, allow for processing time, avoid rushing or interrupting. And then those are some strategies that you could use to kind of make an individual feel comfortable. Another strategy that I like to do is if someone has ever, answered yes, I am having thoughts of suicide, or they've told you that they're having thoughts of suicide. I always go with, thank you for feeling comfortable enough to tell me this. That just kind of immediately lets an individual know that this is a safe space and that this is a safe conversation. And just overall makes them trust you and kind of allow themselves to let their guard down and confide in you as well. So next, after you've kind of asked about suicide, if they say yes, you want to ask if they've thought about how. This will be very important when we kind of talk about safety plans and kind of reducing that access to lethal means. And then we want to hear and listen to one story. So that's arguably kind of the most important section. Oftentimes, when someone has revealed suicidal thoughts or behaviors, we want to immediately kind of go into what's considered safety planning or providing them solutions or resources. And, as this is important, oftentimes people just want you to hear their story. And they just kind of want you to feel, or they just want to feel supported and just not have immediate solutions suggested to them. And then by kind of hearing someone's story, you can kind of listen for a potential turning point or a sign of life. And that can look a lot of different ways. There's a lot of trainings out there that kind of build someone's confidence in being able to identify a turning point and strategies for hearing one story. But yeah, and once you hear a turning point, so that could kind of sound like, all I want to do right now is die. So to any individual, that might just automatically assume that, all you want to do right now is die. But if you think of it as in terms of a turning point, that could imply that there are some times that you do not want to die. And can we kind of further explore those times when you might not want to die and think about how you're feeling during those times and kind of what makes you not want to die, etc. But yeah, there's a lot of trainings out there that really kind of hone in and focus on how to kind of have those conversations and overall increase your confidence in having those conversations as well. And then kind of what to do next. So, as caregivers, you cannot kind of be expected to act as like a licensed mental health professional. If your child has expressed suicidal thoughts or behaviors to you, it's always best to call 988. You shouldn't be required or feel obligated to make any decisions by yourself or without a licensed professional. But you do want to identify if an immediate intervention is necessary. So if an individual is actively trying to hurt themselves or others, call 911. If someone has a plan in place but is not in immediate danger, you can call the mobile crisis response team, which I'll also talk about here shortly. But if you are feeling like they're generally safe, unsure about their safety, you can always call the mobile crisis response team or 988 to be safe, as well as develop a safety plan. So here is an example of a safety plan. And what that does, it's kind of allowing us to recognize some personal warning signs, utilizing internal coping strategies, identifying people or places that provide distraction, reaching out for that social support, accessing professional services, and creating a protective environment, which is the same as kind of reducing access to lethal means. And I will say that there is current ongoing research about safety planning interventions within the autistic community. But I will say safety planning interventions have been shown to reduce suicidal behaviors by 45%. And that is just kind of when it's used as an intervention. I like to think of a safety plan as a preventative tool, because just kind of like we talked about earlier in this presentation, sometimes suicide can occur from life's challenging events, and there's a lot of factors that kind of go into that as well. But sometimes you might not expect or be prepared for when that crisis might occur. So I like to think of it as a preventative tool that anyone can use, similarly to a fire drill or a hurricane evacuation plan, because once that crisis or event occurs, an individual's mindset and judgment might not allow themselves to think clearly during that crisis. And it might be, it's going to make it harder to problem solve, positively cope, and kind of just think clearly through that process. And I will say this is relevant to autistic individuals and non-autistic individuals as well. But it's important to kind of consider to review the plan consistently. Keep it on paper, on a phone or a tablet. Always update it when needed. Share it with those that you do trust. And then, practice role-playing scenarios, such as kind of reaching out to someone to provide a distraction and kind of how you would approach that. And then I will say it needs to be relevant and unique to that individual. Are these warning signs that I actually show? Are these coping strategies that actually help me? Can this person be available to me 24/7 if I were to call them? So those are some things to consider when creating a safety plan. And this is a safety plan developed by 988. There's a lot of different versions out there as well. And then quickly, because I know we're pressed for time, I'll just kind of explain that the 988 Suicide and Crisis Hotline is 24/7. You can call, text, or chat. And there is a lot of ongoing training occurring to kind of train callers on how to better interact with autistic individuals. And I'll just say, you do not have to be in a crisis to call 988. You can call 988 simply to kind of ask questions about how to ask a friend, some potential hypothetical scenarios. But yeah, you do not necessarily have to be in a crisis. And then you can also call 988 to get in contact with your mobile crisis response team. And these are some numbers for the Missouri and Kansas Crisis Lifeline. And then I want to get to anybody's questions, so I'll just show you guys, because I think these slides will get sent out. But here is just kind of some further research, what's needed, and some summary. Just want to emphasize that the research is evolving rapidly, and autistic individuals need to be centered around this research as well. And then here's some present research that's ongoing, some things to be hopeful for as we better understand, how to prevent suicide and why autistic individuals may be at risk. And then here are also some resources about warning signs from 988. Here is a 988 kind of information sheet for the autism community, just kind of like some quick facts. And then here is an organization called the Ollie Foundation that also kind of provides a more friendly, safe plan. And then here is a Reasons for Living chart that was developed by a autism suicide prevention work group. So all of these links are hyperlinked as well, if you guys are able to get these slides, which I think they are. But yeah, so sorry I had to rush a little bit in the end, but does anyone have any questions about kind of what's been talked about today?